Step further into 2024, people across the country are beginning to think about where they will place their vote in this year's election. 23 News reporter Jake Pearson talks to political experts about how younger voters could impact the presidential race.
Young voters may not make their decision for who they want in office in the traditional style. One grad student tells me she's more willing to vote for an independent candidate with her beliefs than to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
This is a year for fastening your seatbelt, I think, if you're going to follow politics.
2024 marks the next opportunity for Americans to cast their vote for the president-elect. But the next generation of voters could throw a wrench in the traditional presidential race process. Out with the old, in with the new. That's what political experts say young voters feel about casting a vote for either of the two major political parties. Rockford University's Bob Evans shares why he thinks this is the case.
They are likely to be specific issue voters that merges into issues of voting rights, social policy, a woman's right to choose, much, much less tied or wedded to a particular party.
Evans says the reason for the change could have to do with the age of the candidates.
The evidence is that younger voters are pretty well disaffected and pretty well disengaged. There's an old term that's misused, generation gap, but there really seems to be one now.
Elmhurst University grad student Amanda McGovern says the internet has helped to change the game when it comes to electing America's leaders.
This generation is really pushing for these issues more. They're more vocal. They know how to use social media. There's going to be some people that don't and some people that don't really care. But I think that they understand more now of the importance of actually voting.
In 2020, 154 million voters turned out for the presidential election, 17 million more than in 2016, according to the census.
Thank you, Jake. And overrepresented groups of voters in that 2020 presidential election included ages 45 and older and those with an associate's degree or with any degree higher than a bachelor's.